I'm a 28-year-old woman, and for as long as I can remember, I've dreamed of visiting Japan. It wasn't just a passing interest. I grew up reading about its history, trying to cook Japanese food, and watching travel documentaries. It was the one place in the world I wanted to see with my own eyes. My mom always told me that if I worked hard and graduated, she would help fund the trip as a congratulatory gift. It was something she repeated so often that I never questioned it. It was just understood. Once I was in a good place financially, I'd finally go on my dream vacation. So, I worked. I put myself through college, balancing full-time studies with a job to cover tuition and living expenses. After graduation, I found a stable job, moved into my own place, and started saving seriously. Every extra dollar went into my travel fund. I wasn't reckless with money. I budgeted, I made sacrifices, and I waited until I was in the perfect position to go. But every time I brought up booking the trip, my mom had an excuse. She would tell me it wasn't the right time, that something more important needed my attention first. One time, she suggested I wait until she could come with me so we could experience it together. Another time, she mentioned how the family was struggling financially and that maybe I could help out instead. It was always something, but I wasn't in a rush. I had waited this long, I could wait a little longer. Then, out of nowhere, my younger sister, Lily 25F, announced that she and her boyfriend were planning a luxury European vacation. She didn't have the money for it, but that didn't seem to be stopping her. She was gushing about five-star hotels, private tours, and fancy restaurants. When I asked her how she planned to afford it, she brushed it off, saying she had it handled. I didn't think much of it at the time. Lily had always been the type to act first and figure out the details later. She had never been good with money, but somehow things always worked out for her. I assumed her boyfriend's family was paying for the trip, or that she'd racked up another credit card bill she had no plan to pay off. I only found out the truth when I logged onto Instagram one day and saw the pictures. Lily in front of the Eiffel Tower, Lily posing on a gondola in Venice, Lily clinking glasses at a rooftop bar in Santorini. Every post had some overly dramatic caption about how this was a once-in-a-lifetime experience and how she was so lucky to have a family that supports her dreams. It didn't make sense until I saw the comment from my mom underneath one of the posts. "Anything for my girls, you deserve this." A sinking feeling hit me. I opened my banking app, and sure enough, my dedicated travel savings account was wiped out. My mother had always been listed as a secondary account holder from when I was younger, something I had never thought to change. She had drained every last dollar. I called my mom immediately, and she didn't even try to deny it. She told me she had used the money to pay for Lily's trip because Lily needed it more. Apparently, my sister had been feeling down lately, and my mom thought a luxury vacation would lift her spirits. She told me I had plenty of time to go to Japan, and that I shouldn't be so selfish when Lily never gets to do things like this. I reminded her that this wasn't some spare change sitting in a bank account, it was my savings. The money I had spent years putting away, dollar by dollar, waiting for the right time. She acted like it was no big deal. When I asked her how she expected me to afford my own trip now, she just scoffed and said, "You have a good job, don't you? You can always save up again." I hung up before I said something I'd regret. Lily, of course, had no shame. When I confronted her, she acted like I was overreacting. She told me it was just money, and that I should be happy for her. According to her, I had been obsessed with Japan for years, so I would go eventually. Meanwhile, she and her boyfriend were living in the moment. I didn't bother arguing. It was clear they had no guilt, no remorse. So I did the only thing I could do. I booked my Japan trip anyway. I had been saving in a separate emergency fund, and with a work bonus that had recently come in, I had enough to make it happen. First-class flights, luxury hotels, private tours. If my own mother could steal from me to give my sister an extravagant vacation, then I wasn't going to hold back on myself. The second I started posting my own travel photos, though, the real drama began. Because the moment my mom saw that I had gone without her, she completely lost it. The moment I landed in Japan, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Call after call, text after text. My mother had gone into full meltdown mode. She was furious. Apparently, she never actually thought I would go without her. She had assumed I would either give in to guilt, or at least bring her along. Now she was panicking, bombarding me with messages about how I had abandoned her, and how she couldn't believe I would be so selfish. Every message followed the same pattern. First the outrage, how dare I leave her behind after everything she had done for me. Then the guilt, how a good daughter would have made sure her mother was taken care of first. And finally the desperation, how she was just so hurt that I didn't even consider including her. I ignored every single message. Instead, I checked into my hotel, stretched out on my king-sized bed, and let the realization sink in. I was finally here. After years of saving, working and waiting, I had made it, and I wasn't going to let her ruin it. A few hours later, I posted my first photo, a simple shot of the view from my hotel balcony. Within minutes my phone lit up again, but this time it wasn't just my mom. Relatives started chiming in. Some were subtle, sending passive-aggressive messages about how much my mother loved me, and how family should always come first. Others went straight for the attack, calling me cold-hearted for leaving my poor mother behind. But not everyone was against me. A few relatives reached out in support, telling me they understood why I had gone no contact for this trip. Apparently, my mom had already started spinning the narrative, acting like I had randomly cut her off for no reason. The moment she realized that some family members weren't falling for it, she switched tactics. That's when Lily decided to insert herself. Instead of showing even the slightest bit of remorse, she took the opportunity to mock me. She sent me a message saying I needed to stop being so bitter, and that I should have at least considered bringing our mom along. It was like she had completely forgotten that my entire travel fund had been stolen to pay for her vacation. I didn't respond. I didn't block her either. She wasn't worth the effort. Instead, I put my phone on silent, muted every family group chat, and decided that for the next few weeks I was going to pretend they didn't exist. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control. I threw myself into my trip. I explored Kyoto's temples, wandered through Shibuya's neon-lit streets, and sat in quiet cafes, drinking matcha while watching the world go by. I attended a traditional tea ceremony, booked a private tour of an ancient castle, and indulged in every single thing I had dreamed of doing for years. Back home, things were slowly unraveling. First, my mother started reaching out to relatives, trying to get small loans here and there. Then she maxed out another credit card. Soon the pressure started mounting, and the cracks began to show. A cousin reached out, letting me know that my mom had officially started struggling with her credit card payments. Apparently, she had maxed out multiple cards to cover Lily's trip, and was now scrambling to find someone to bail her out. A day later, I got a message from my mom. She needed a small loan to help cover some unexpected expenses. She promised she would pay it back soon, and even threw in a sad story about how she was really struggling. I didn't even entertain the idea. I responded with a single message, reminding her that she had stolen my travel fund for Lily's trip. That was it. No argument, no back and forth. Just a simple reminder of exactly why she was in this position. Her response? Silence. At least at first. The next day, she took her complaints to Facebook. Suddenly, there were dramatic posts about how her ungrateful daughter had left her behind, how she had sacrificed so much for me only to be abandoned, and how she was just a struggling mother who needed a little support. I didn't reply. I didn't even acknowledge it. Meanwhile, Lily continued posting about her European adventure like nothing was wrong. She was still posting pictures of expensive dinners, designer shopping trips, and boat tours, completely oblivious to the fact that our mother was spiraling. When the guilt tripping didn't work, my mom switched tactics again. She started sending me old photos, pictures from when I was a kid, memories of past family vacations, screenshots of old messages where I had told her I loved her. Every single message was a clear attempt to manipulate me, to remind me of who we used to be so I would cave in and feel bad for her. I didn't respond. Instead, I checked my itinerary and saw that my hotel had an option to extend my stay at a discounted rate. I booked an extra few nights, using some saved-up travel points, and treated myself to a countryside ryokan stay, soaking in an onsen under the stars, while sipping sake. A few days later, a cousin sent me a warning. My mom was planning to show up at the airport when I got back. I didn't even hesitate. I extended my trip by another week. Extending my trip was the best decision I could have made. The idea of landing back home and walking straight into a full-blown confrontation with my mother at the airport was not something I was willing to deal with. So I changed my flight, booked an extra week at a luxury ryokan in the mountains, and gave myself more time to enjoy Japan without the stress of whatever chaos was brewing back home. It didn't take long for my mother to realize what I had done. The moment she saw that I hadn't arrived as expected, the frantic messages started again. That's when the emergency happened. Suddenly, my mother was claiming that something terrible had happened, and that I needed to come home immediately. No details, just vague messages about how things were falling apart, and how she didn't know what to do. I wasn't buying it. Instead of responding, I called my cousin, the only relative who had been straight with me about what was happening back home. They checked in with other family members and got back to me within minutes. No emergency, no crisis, just my mother trying to manipulate me into coming home early. I let the messages pile up and spent the day soaking in an outdoor onsen, drinking tea, and enjoying a full kaiseki dinner served in my room. If she wanted me to panic and rush home, it wasn't happening. Then, out of nowhere, Lily reached out. Her tone had completely changed. Gone was the arrogance, the mocking attitude from before. Now she was playing the role of the concerned sister, talking about how she didn't want us to be like this, and how we should talk. It was obvious what was happening. She had ignored the problem for as long as it wasn't affecting her. But now that our mother's financial situation was spiraling, she suddenly wanted to fix things. I didn't bother responding. There was nothing to say. A few days later, my cousin gave me an update. My mother had been juggling multiple credit card payments, borrowing from relatives, and delaying bills to keep up the illusion of financial stability. But now, with no new sources of money, she had officially defaulted on one of her major credit cards. The bank was on her case, and she was frantically calling relatives, trying to get someone to bail her out. Most of them refused. For years she had made a habit of borrowing money and never paying it back. People were finally catching on. And then something happened that I wasn't expecting. One of my relatives publicly called her out on Facebook. They posted a long, detailed comment under one of her dramatic posts, spelling out exactly what had happened. How she had stolen my money, given it to Lily, and now expected me to fix the mess. The reaction was instant. Some people tried to defend her, but others, ones who had been on the fence before, started backing away. The story was out. She couldn't twist it anymore. I took that as my cue to unfriend both her and Lily on every platform. If they wanted to talk, they could do it somewhere else. They no longer had access to my life. Meanwhile, I was thriving. With no distractions, I fully indulged in the last week of my trip. I booked a spa retreat, took a private food tour, and indulged in every experience I had planned, even the extravagant omakase dinner I had once thought was out of reach. Back home, my mother was running out of options. That's when she tried a new tactic, threatening to disown me if I didn't help. A message popped up from an unknown number. It was long, dramatic, filled with accusations about how I had betrayed her, and how if I didn't step up, she would be forced to cut me out of her life. I replied with 2 words, "Go ahead." Her response came within minutes, but I didn't read it. I muted the number and went back to enjoying my night. The next day, I got messages from relatives telling me to be the bigger person. Some of them tried to guilt me about family loyalty, but I ignored them all. They weren't offering to help her financially either. They just wanted me to do it so they wouldn't have to. Then came the final trick. A relative reached out, telling me my mother had suddenly fallen ill. She was supposedly too weak to talk, too heartbroken to eat, and someone needed to be there for her. I didn't even bother checking if it was real. By this point, it was obvious she was throwing everything at the wall to see what would stick. I ignored it, and unsurprisingly, within a few days she was miraculously feeling better. The only person who reached out with something worth saying was my dad. My parents had been divorced for years, and while he had always tried to stay out of the drama, he had been keeping up with everything. He sent me a simple message, telling me that he was proud of me for standing my ground, that I had every right to put myself first, and that he was glad I wasn't letting them walk all over me anymore. That was all I needed to hear. As I packed my bags for my flight home, I realized something. This was the first time I had ever put myself first without guilt, and I wasn't going back. When I finally boarded my flight home, it was on my own terms. No airport ambush, no dramatic confrontation, just a quiet departure from Japan with no one knowing my exact arrival time. I had turned off location sharing, ignored every message from my mother and Lily, and made sure that when I landed, no one would be waiting for me. The moment I stepped off the plane, I went straight to my apartment. No detours, no stops. I called for a cab, kept my phone on silent, and didn't breathe a word to anyone that I was back. It didn't take long for my mother to figure it out. Less than 24 hours later, the messages started flooding in. First, the guilt. How I had abandoned her, how she had spent weeks worrying about me, and how she just wanted to talk. Then came the desperation, how she was struggling, how I should step up and do the right thing. I ignored every single one. Then Lily jumped in. She was still on her high horse, still acting like she had done nothing wrong. Instead of apologizing, she called me spoiled for taking a first-class trip instead of helping our mother. According to her, I should have used my money to fix the mess instead of spending it on myself. She didn't mention that her own vacation had been paid for with stolen money. I left her on rid. A few days later, a cousin reached out with an update. My mother was drowning in debt, creditors were hounding her, and she had burned bridges with most of the family by constantly begging for financial help. No one wanted to deal with her anymore. Then, months later, I got another fraud alert. Someone had tried to take out a loan in my name, using old documents. I immediately filed a fraud report, though part of me wasn't surprised. My mother had already tried this once before. My mother's name was all over the application. I shut it down immediately. I froze my credit, updated every security measure possible, and contacted my bank to make sure nothing slipped through. Then I sent my mother a single message: "Try this again, and I'll have the police involved." No back and forth, no room for excuses, just a clear warning. Her response was instant: panic, denial, more excuses. I didn't read any of it. I blocked her number. Then I blocked Lily's too. For the first time in my life, I was truly done. Blocking my mother and Lily across every platform was long overdue. There was nothing left to say. No explanation, no argument, just silence. But silence wasn't something my mother could handle. Within days, she took her meltdown to Facebook. Long, dramatic posts started popping up, each one painting herself as the victim of a cruel, heartless daughter. According to her, I had abandoned my own family and left her to suffer alone after she had sacrificed so much for me. She made sure to highlight how selfish I was for spending thousands on a trip while she was struggling. She conveniently left out the part where she had stolen my travel fund to pay for Lily's luxury vacation. The posts got traction. Some relatives who had no idea what had really happened jumped in, commenting about how family should always come first and how I should be grateful for everything my mother had done for me. Others, the ones who already knew about the fraud and manipulation, stayed quiet. Then my dad got involved. Unlike my mother, my dad never engaged in family drama. He had divorced her years ago and had always kept a distance. But this time he wasn't going to sit back and let her rewrite the story. Under one of her posts, he left a single comment: "You stole from her. Now you're mad, she won't bail you out. Tell the full story." The reaction was immediate. Some relatives who had been blindly defending her started asking questions. A few even reached out to me privately, wanting to know if it was true. Others doubled down, saying I should forgive and forget because she's still my mother. I ignored it all. That's when she tried something new. Suddenly there was a health crisis. Messages started circulating that she had fallen gravely ill, and that the stress of everything had taken a toll on her. The implication was clear: if something happened to her, it would be my fault. It took me one phone call to confirm it was a lie. A cousin who lived nearby checked in and found her perfectly fine. No hospital visits, no health issues, just another desperate attempt to manipulate me into reaching out. But this time the lie backfired. Some of the family members who had previously been neutral were now done with her. They had watched her pull stunt after stunt, and now that she was fabricating health issues, even they were backing away. Meanwhile, Lily was changing her tune. She must have realized that our mother's credibility was gone, because she suddenly started reaching out again. Her messages were careful, almost like she was testing the waters. She tried to act like she had never really been part of the problem, as if she hadn't benefited from the stolen money, as if she hadn't mocked me before my trip. I shut it down immediately. You enabled this. Now deal with it. She didn't message again. Back home, my mother's financial problems were getting worse. With no help from me, creditors were now going after her aggressively. She was calling anyone who would listen, trying to get financial help from distant relatives, old friends, anyone. No one was biting. Then she made one last desperate move. She sent an email to my workplace. She didn't hold back. She painted me as a terrible, selfish person, claiming that I had stolen from my own family and was heartless enough to let my own mother suffer. It was clear what she was trying to do. She wanted to ruin my reputation, to make me look bad in front of my employer. It backfired spectacularly. My boss called me into his office, handed me a printout of the email, and asked if I wanted a copy for my records in case I needed it for a restraining order. Then he laughed. If she emails again, we'll just block her. And that was that. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't reach me. I had cut her off completely. Since my mother had tried to ruin my reputation, I decided it was time to set the record straight. I wrote a single post, short, factual, and to the point. I explained how I had saved for years for my dream trip, how my mother had stolen that money to fund Lily's vacation, and how, when I refused to fix their financial mess, they turned against me. I didn't add unnecessary details or emotions. I let the facts speak for themselves. The post spread fast. Family members who had been on the fence started reaching out. Some apologized for believing my mother's lies. Others who had blindly supported her suddenly had nothing to say. It was clear that, for the first time, she couldn't twist the story in her favor. And then the fallout began. My mother started losing friends and support. The same people who had once sympathized with her now saw her for who she really was. The messages defending her stopped. The dramatic Facebook posts dried up. Lily, sensing the shift, started backpedaling. She tried to act like she had never really been part of it, like she had just been caught in the middle of a bad situation. She conveniently left out the fact that she had mocked me before my trip, and had fully enjoyed the stolen money, while my mother dug herself deeper into debt. I didn't let it slide. You benefited from this mess. You don't get to play innocent now. She didn't respond. Then karma caught up with her. A cousin let me know that Lily's boyfriend had dumped her. He had finally realized how entitled she was, how she expected everyone else to clean up her messes. Now she was broke, struggling, and for the first time had no one to bail her out. And then one last message came through. My mother, out of options, reached out again. She claimed she was willing to make amends if I could just help her out with one small payment. I sent a single response. You can ask Lily. She thought vacations were more important than responsibilities. I never heard from her again. To make sure there were no loose ends, I finalized everything, locked down my accounts, updated security settings, and blocked every possible way my mother could reach me. Then I booked my next solo trip. This time I chose Greece. First class, private tours, luxury all the way. No more guilt, no more second chances. For the first time I was completely free. With my mother and Lily completely blocked, my life became peaceful for the first time in years. No more manipulation, no more drama, just silence. I had my finances locked down, my security settings updated, and every possible way for them to contact me cut off. But of course that didn't stop my mother from trying. A cousin reached out to let me know that despite being blocked everywhere, my mother was still desperate to reach me. She had resorted to using fake numbers, creating new social media accounts, and even asking distant relatives to pass along messages. No one was responding. She had burned too many bridges, and people were getting tired of her antics. Then things got worse for her. I found out that my mother had officially defaulted on her rent. She had managed to keep up payments for a while by borrowing from distant relatives and maxing out more credit. But with no new sources of income, the eviction notice finally arrived. She had stretched out her resources as long as she could, but with no financial help coming in, reality had finally caught up. The landlord had given her multiple warnings, and now she was out of chances. Lily, for the first time in her life, was facing real consequences. Without my mother paying her way, she was suddenly in financial trouble too. Her savings, if she ever had any, were gone, and her boyfriend had dumped her, leaving her to figure things out on her own. The desperation hit fast. My mother started spreading stories to anyone who would listen, claiming I had let my own mother and sister become homeless. She played the victim, painting me as the cruel daughter who abandoned her struggling family while she had done everything for me. I didn't acknowledge a single word of it. Lily, meanwhile, was getting a harsh reality check. A family friend mentioned that she was finally realizing how difficult life was when she had to rely on herself. There was no one left to bail her out, and for the first time she was actually struggling. Then, after months of silence, she reached out. She sent a long-winded email, claiming she now understood why I had been upset. She didn't directly apologize, but the message was clear. She wanted help. She mentioned how things had been hard since our mother's eviction, how she was trying to get back on her feet, and how she just needed a little support. I deleted the email without responding. With no other options left, my mother made one last desperate move. She called my dad. She begged him to talk some sense into me, to convince me to help her out, to make me understand that families shouldn't turn their backs on each other. He laughed in her face. His response was short and brutal. "You made your bed. Now lie in it." That was the final straw for everyone. The last few relatives who had still been defending her finally saw the truth. She had no more supporters, no one left to manipulate. She was on her own. The last update I got was that my mother had moved into a low-budget apartment with a roommate, and Lily had taken a minimum wage job. Watching them struggle should have made me feel bad. It didn't. They had every chance to do right by me, and they chose betrayal. Now they were dealing with the consequences, without me. Months of silence passed, and for the first time in my life, I experienced what true peace felt like. No manipulation, no guilt tripping, no unexpected financial disasters caused by my mother or Lily. My job was going great, my savings were growing, and I had started making plans for my next solo trip. Just when I thought she had finally given up, my mother made one last desperate attempt. An email arrived from an unfamiliar address, but it didn't take long to figure out who it was from. The subject line alone was dramatic. "We need to talk before it's too late." The message was long, filled with the usual emotional manipulation. She claimed she had changed, that she had learned from her mistakes, and that I would regret cutting her out one day. She reminded me that family is forever, and that when I eventually had children, I would finally understand why mothers make sacrifices for their kids. It was the same routine, twisting the story, painting herself as the misunderstood mother, pretending that everything she did was for my own good. I sent a single reply: "You sacrificed me for Lily. Now live with it." Minutes later, another email arrived. This time the mask had dropped. The message was filled with insults, calling me ungrateful, cruel, heartless. She blamed me for her financial struggles, claiming I had turned my back on my family. It was a desperate attempt to get some kind of reaction. I didn't reply. I didn't even open any further messages. I blocked the email and went on with my day. Surprisingly, Lily never reached out. For the first time, she actually respected my boundary. Whether it was because she had finally learned her lesson, or because she was too embarrassed, I didn't care. The silence was all I needed. Months passed, and then I discovered the final betrayal. I was doing a routine check of my credit report when I saw it, an attempted loan application under my name. My mother had tried to take out another loan using my information. I reported the fraud immediately. With all the security measures I had put in place, the attempt had been flagged before anything could go through. But that wasn't enough for me. This time, I wasn't just shutting it down. I was making sure she faced real consequences. Her actions left a mark on her financial record. When she tried to dispute it, she had no proof, no way to explain why she was trying to open accounts in her daughter's name. A judge dismissed her case instantly. That was the end of it. From what I heard, Lily was still struggling, working a regular job for the first time in her life. Without my mother to bail her out, she had no choice but to rely on herself. Meanwhile, my life only got better. I earned a promotion, my savings grew, and I finally started planning my next trip. This time, I set my sights on Greece. First-class flights, private tours, and complete freedom. I used to feel guilty for setting boundaries. Now I feel nothing but relief. Before booking my trip, I deleted every last trace of contact with my mother and Lily. No numbers saved, no email addresses, no way for them to reach me again. With my toxic family behind me, I packed my bags, stepped onto my flight, and walked into my new life, completely free. I'm a 29-year-old woman, and up until recently, I thought I had a pretty good life. A stable job, a loving boyfriend, and plans for a future that finally felt like it was mine to shape. But the reality? My mother had her claws in every decision I made, and I didn't even realize it until she cost me the best relationship I've ever had. I met Adam when I was 26. He was everything I could have asked for: kind, patient, supportive. He had this way of making me feel seen, like I wasn't just someone's daughter or someone's obligation. We clicked instantly. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was with someone who genuinely cared about me, not what I could do for them. From the beginning, my mom didn't like it. Not because there was anything wrong with Adam, but because I was spending less time at her beck and call. My mom is the type of woman who always made herself the center of attention. She loved to remind me how much she sacrificed for me, how she gave up opportunities, how she worked long hours, how she stayed in a bad marriage for my sake. And according to her, I owed her for that. Every choice I made had to be filtered through her first: where I went to college, what job I took, even where I lived. At first, the interference was subtle. Every time I spent a weekend with Adam, she'd make little comments. "I barely see you anymore. I guess I'm not important now that you have him. You used to care about your family." Then came the guilt trips, stories about how she was so lonely, how she felt abandoned. If I didn't answer her calls right away, she'd leave voicemails about how she was worried sick. If I didn't drop everything to visit her, she'd suddenly have a bad feeling about something, making me feel like I was the worst daughter in the world. Then came the emergencies. Every single time Adam and I had something planned, a dinner, a trip, even just a quiet night at home, something would go wrong, or her car wouldn't start. She'd slip and hurt her ankle. She'd have a panic attack and just need someone to talk to. And every single time I'd cave. I'd rush over, comfort her. And by the time I realized what was happening, another night with Adam had been ruined. For a while, Adam was patient. He understood that my mom and I had a complicated relationship. But after 2 years of this, his patience started running out. He saw what I couldn't, that my mom wasn't just struggling with boundaries. She was deliberately sabotaging us. He started pushing back. He'd tell me to let her handle her own problems, that she was an adult and didn't need me to play the role of her emotional caretaker. I defended her. I told him she was just sensitive, that she didn't have anyone else, that it wasn't her fault. Then we moved in together and everything escalated. My mom hated it. She acted like I had personally betrayed her. She called me crying, saying I had abandoned her. She said Adam was stealing me away and that I was letting him alienate me from my family. If I didn't pick up the phone when she called, she'd show up at our apartment unannounced, making a scene at the door until I let her in. She'd sit on our couch, sulking, talking about how empty the house felt without me. The worst part? She started planting doubts in my head about Adam. She'd tell me I needed to be careful, that he was controlling. She said men like him start off nice, but eventually they show their true colors. I ignored it at first, but over time it started to chip away at me. The way she said it, so casual yet so serious, made me wonder, was she right? Was I being manipulated? Adam saw what was happening. One night, after yet another fight about my mom, he sat me down and told me, I can't do this forever. If you don't start setting boundaries, I don't know how much longer I can stay in this relationship. It hit me like a truck. I had never thought about it in those terms before. Losing Adam? Over my mom? It seemed impossible. I promised I'd do better. I swore I'd make changes. But then came the breaking point. Adam had been planning a proposal. I found out later from one of his friends that he'd even picked out a ring. He was going to propose during a vacation we had planned, our first real getaway without my mother interfering. But, as expected, my mom had a crisis. The night before we were supposed to leave, she called me in hysterics. She'd fallen. She couldn't move. She needed me. I dropped everything and went to her house. She was fine. She was sitting on the couch when I got there, completely fine. No injuries, nothing. Just a mother who wanted her daughter back in her orbit. By the time I got home, the damage was done. Adam sat me down and told me he couldn't do this anymore, that he loved me, but he refused to be in a relationship where he was always second place. I begged him to stay. I promised I'd change, but it was too late. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I love you, but I can't do this anymore. I need to know that I come first sometimes. I need to see real change. If you can't set boundaries with her, I don't see a future for us. His voice was raw, exhausted. I'll give you a month, but if nothing changes, I have to go. That was the first time I realized he was serious, and I might actually lose him. The next day, my mother called, acting all concerned, asking me if I was okay. When I told her Adam was gone, she didn't sound surprised. Instead, she sighed and said, if he really loved you, he wouldn't have left. That was the moment everything clicked. She had won. She had gotten exactly what she wanted. And the worst part? She didn't even have to try that hard. I sat in my apartment, alone, realizing that I had spent my whole life playing by her rules. And for what? For this? That's when I decided I wasn't going to let her win again. The apartment felt empty in a way it never had before. Every little thing reminded me of Adam, his coffee mug still in the sink, the extra blanket on the couch, the spare toothbrush in the bathroom. The silence stretched long, unbroken by his laugh, his voice, the casual way he used to hum while making breakfast. Days blurred together, and for the first time in years, I had no idea what to do with myself. My mom started calling immediately. At first, it was all sympathy, soft, almost soothing. She acted like she understood, like she felt bad for me. She kept saying it was such a shame, that Adam just wasn't strong enough to handle real life, that relationships are give and take, and maybe I just gave too much. Every time she spoke, her voice carried this smug, knowing tone, like this had been inevitable, like she had known all along that Adam wouldn't last. The first time she suggested I come stay with her just for a little while, I almost agreed. I was exhausted. Work felt impossible to focus on, and our apartment, felt wrong. But then Sarah came over, and the second I told her what was happening, she didn't even hesitate. She's loving this, she said, grabbing takeout from the bag she'd brought over. Don't you see it? She wanted this to happen? I started to argue, but Sarah didn't let me. She reminded me of all the times I'd canceled plans because of my mom's emergencies, how she'd always had something negative to say about Adam, how she had treated every serious relationship I'd ever had the same way. Then she asked me something I couldn't ignore. Can you think of a single time she was genuinely happy for you? Not when you did something for her, not when you made her life easier, just happy for you. I couldn't. That conversation stuck with me. It made me start thinking, really thinking, about the patterns in my life. How every time I'd gotten close to someone, my mom had found a way to wedge herself between us. How she always had something to say, a warning, a little doubt to plant. How she was always there just enough to make things harder, but never enough to take any of the blame when things fell apart. A few days after that conversation, my mom started asking for things. Small, at first. Could I pick up a few groceries for her? Her car was acting up again. Could I drop her at the mechanic? Then, suddenly she was too tired to cook, too stressed to deal with errands. Before I even realized it, I was falling back into my old role, showing up whenever she needed something. Because wasn't that just easier than fighting her? I caught myself one afternoon, standing in her kitchen, making her dinner while she scrolled on her phone. I was doing everything I used to do before Adam, slipping back into the daughter she wanted me to be, the one who never said no. That night, I looked up therapists in my area and booked an appointment. The first session, my therapist listened to everything. Adam, my mom, the guilt I couldn't shake, the exhaustion I didn't even recognize until I started talking about it. She let me ramble, and when I finally stopped, she looked at me and asked, if this was a romantic partner treating you this way, what would you call it? I didn't have an answer, but I knew what she meant. The next time my mom called, asking me to come stay the weekend, I told her no. I barely got the words out before she started crying. She asked if she had done something wrong, if I was mad at her. When I didn't give in, the tears dried up fast. She told me I was being selfish, that she'd always put me first, that I had changed. That night, she texted me about her health, how she'd been feeling off, how she just hoped I wouldn't regret pushing her away. Sarah kept checking in, and at some point, she told me Adam had been doing well. He had gone on a trip with friends, was dating again, looked happier. I didn't ask for details, and she didn't push. Scrolling through social media, I froze. A mutual acquaintance had posted photos from a gathering. There was my mom, smiling, drink in hand, chatting with friends. My stomach dropped. Just 2 nights ago, she had called me, voice weak and frail, claiming she was bedridden. The realization hit like a slap. She had never been sick. She had just wanted control. Something snapped. I stopped answering her calls. When she asked me for money, I told her no. I told her she needed to figure things out on her own. That's when the real meltdown started. She called my relatives, her siblings, my cousins, even some family friends, crying about how I was abandoning her. I started getting messages from people I hadn't spoken to in years, telling me how much my mom loved me, how family was everything, how one day I'd regret this. But I wasn't regretting anything. For the first time in my life, I wasn't reacting. I wasn't rushing to fix things, to smooth things over. I was watching her unravel, watching how quickly she turned to everyone else the moment she realized I wasn't falling for it. I started reading about narcissistic parents, about enmeshment, about control disguised as love, about guilt being used as a weapon. And the more I read, the more I understood this wasn't going to stop until I made it stop. But breaking free wasn't going to be easy. The conversation wasn't planned. It happened in the middle of one of my mom's usual guilt-tripping calls, her voice dripping with disappointment over how I'd changed and how I never made time for her anymore. Something about the way she said it, so casual, like she had every right to expect my life to revolve around hers, pushed me over the edge. I cut her off mid-sentence and told her, as calmly as I could, that I was taking a step back. I needed space. I needed time for myself. There was a long, stunned silence on the other end of the line, and then the explosion came. It wasn't just yelling, it was a full-blown meltdown. My mother accused me of being ungrateful, of turning my back on my own family. She claimed I was being brainwashed, that I wasn't acting like myself anymore. Every sentence was dripping with betrayal, as if I had committed some unforgivable crime by wanting to set boundaries. Then came the switch, the tears, the wounded, pitiful voice, the declarations of how she'd only ever tried to protect me, how I would understand one day, how she just loved me too much. It was so rehearsed, so predictable, that it felt almost mechanical. For the first time, I didn't react. I didn't try to comfort her, didn't try to explain myself, didn't let myself fall into the trap of justifying why I needed space. I ended the call, and that's when the flying monkeys started. Within an hour, I had texts from aunts, cousins, even a couple of my mom's friends, people I barely spoke to, suddenly invested in my rude behavior. The messages ranged from guilt-tripping, she's your mother, she loves you more than anything, to outright attacks, I don't know what's wrong with you, but you need to fix it before it's too late. I started blocking them. One by one, I shut down every avenue they tried to use to get to me. Then I blocked my mom. The first day was quiet. The second day, too. By the third day, my phone felt lighter. I had no missed calls, no guilt-laced voicemails, no panicked messages demanding my attention. But the silence wasn't peaceful, it was deafening. I kept checking my phone, expecting the next manipulation attempt. By day 8, the silence broke. A number I didn't recognize called. My stomach twisted in anxiety. I debated ignoring it, but my old fears won out. I picked up. A relative, one of the few I still trusted, was on the line, sounding frantic. Your mom's in the hospital. I was in my car before I even realized I'd grabbed my keys. My heart was racing, panic flooding through me, because despite everything, the idea of my mom alone in a hospital bed, struggling, suffering, terrified me. I sped through traffic, nearly ran a red light. The whole way there, my mind played worst-case scenarios. A stroke, a heart attack, a fall that left her unconscious. I ran into the hospital, breathless, expecting to hear something horrible. She wasn't in a hospital bed. She wasn't even sick. She was sitting in the waiting area, scrolling through her phone, completely fine. The second she saw me, she gasped like she had willed me into existence, eyes wide with fake shock. Then she launched into another one of her rehearsed performances, how she'd felt so dizzy she thought she was dying, how she knew I wouldn't abandon her, how she was so relieved to see me. I didn't even let her finish. Right there, in the middle of that hospital parking lot, I lost it. The words came out loud, sharp, final. I told her this was the last time she would ever manipulate me, the last time she would use fear, guilt, or lies to control my life. I turned around and walked away. She called after me, her voice cracking, but I didn't stop. That night, I told my therapist everything. She listened, nodded, then asked something that felt like a gut punch. You have to be willing to grieve the mother you wish you had, because the one you do have isn't going to change. The next day, my mom sent a long email. This time, she wasn't yelling. She was playing the victim. She talked about how hard life was without me, how lonely she was, how she just wanted her daughter back. I didn't answer. Instead, I sat down and wrote a letter. Not to her, to Adam. I hadn't spoken to him since he left, but there were things I needed to say. I wrote about how I saw it now, how I understood why he walked away, how I was sorry, how I wasn't expecting anything from him, but I just needed him to know. I debated sending it. I almost tore it up. But instead, I dialed his number. When he answered, there was a pause, then a quiet, cautious hello. I told him everything. He listened. And when I was done, he thanked me. Told me he was glad I was figuring things out. He sounded good, strong, happy. He didn't say anything about seeing me again, about staying in touch, about reconnecting. And I knew, even before I hung up, that this was closure. That same night, my mom made her next move. She offered me money, a gift, a trip, a car, even help with rent, anything to pull me back in. I refused. That's when she snapped. The threat started. She was done with me. She was writing me out of the will. She never wanted to see me again. I said, okay. And that was the moment she truly lost control. Over the next few days, I packed up everything I still had at her house. Old belongings, gifts she had used as weapons, pieces of my childhood that felt tainted now. I put it all in boxes, returned the keys, and left them at her doorstep. Before I blocked her number for good, I sent one final text. I love you, but I will no longer tolerate manipulation. Please don't contact me. Then I hit block. And for the first time in my life, I was free. The first few days after blocking my mom's number were eerily quiet. No guilt-tripping texts, no fake emergencies, no sudden calls from relatives pushing me to fix things. For the first time in years, my phone wasn't a source of anxiety. But the silence wasn't comforting, it was unsettling, like the calm before a storm. By day 4, the storm arrived. A flood of emails started appearing in my inbox, all from unfamiliar accounts. My mom had clearly made new ones just to get through to me. The subject lines were all the same: dramatic, urgent, guilt-ridden. A daughter should never abandon her mother. You will regret this when I'm gone. You used to be a good person. I ignored them. Then the messages from family members started coming in. Word had spread quickly that I had cut off my own mother, and people had opinions. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in years sent a long, furious text about how family is everything, and how I was being cruel and selfish. An aunt called 3 times in a row, leaving voicemails about how my mother was heartbroken and devastated, and how I needed to apologize before it was too late. I blocked them. A week after going no contact, a text from an unknown number popped up on my screen. Mom is in the hospital. You need to come. My stomach dropped. I sat there, staring at the message, debating whether I should ignore it or rush out the door. Before I could spiral, I called a friend, one of the few people who had seen my mom's manipulation firsthand. She offered to check for me. An hour later, she sent me a picture of my mom, not in a hospital bed, not even at a doctor's office, at a cafe, sipping coffee with a friend, laughing. I turned off my phone. Then something unexpected happened. My older cousin Rachel reached out. Unlike the others, she didn't demand I make amends. She didn't push for a reconciliation. She asked if I was okay. She told me she understood. She had gone through the exact same thing with her own mother, my mom's sister, the guilt tripping, the manipulation, the constant cycle of control disguised as love. Rachel told me that it took her years to finally break free, and even now, she still had moments where she second-guessed herself. And stay strong, she said. She will never stop. You have to be the one to stop it. The next day, my mom switched tactics. People started reaching out, not with concern, but with whispers. My mom was telling everyone I had become mentally unstable, that I had been brainwashed by outside influences, that I wasn't myself anymore. An old family friend called to say she had heard that I was struggling and that my mom was so worried about me. My mom was acting as if I had suddenly lost my mind and that she was the one suffering because of it. Then came the legal threats. Another email appeared in my inbox. This time it wasn't about love or guilt. It was about responsibility. She claimed she was consulting a lawyer. That as her daughter, I had an obligation to take care of her, that she had rights. I laughed. My therapist told me to keep every email, every voicemail, every text. You need proof, she said, because if she escalates, you'll want documentation. I started saving everything. Then, for the first time in my life, I let myself think about something that had always felt impossible. Moving. A fresh start. A new city. A place where no one would expect me to keep showing up, to keep sacrificing, to keep putting my mother's needs before my own. I had spent my entire adult life making decisions based on how they would affect her. What if I made one just for me? Before I could even process that thought, another relative reached out. This time, they weren't angry. They were hopeful. Mom was willing to forgive everything. If I just came to visit, if I just talked to her, she was willing to put the past behind us. There was a gift involved too, an expensive one, something she knew I would love. I ignored the message. Then I saw it, the Facebook post. My mom had taken the drama public. A long, heartfelt message about how some children forget the sacrifices their parents made and how a mother's love is unconditional, even when it isn't returned. The comment section was filled with sympathy. People telling her she was such a good mother, that I would come around one day, that she deserved better. I clenched my jaw and closed the app. That same night, I got a message from an old friend, someone I hadn't spoken to in years, but who had seen glimpses of what I had been through. Hey, I just wanted to say, I'm proud of you. I know this isn't easy, but you did the right thing. That was the moment everything shifted. Because for the first time, I wasn't drowning in guilt. I wasn't panicking over my mother's next move. I was free. My mother didn't control me anymore, and I wasn't going back. Weeks passed with nothing but silence. No emails, no messages from family, no dramatic Facebook posts. It was almost too quiet. I knew my mom well enough to know that she wasn't finished. She was just waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment came early one morning when my phone buzzed with a call from my apartment's front desk. My mom was downstairs. She hadn't called ahead, hadn't sent a message, she had just shown up. Security said she was demanding to see me, insisting there had been some sort of misunderstanding. I told them not to let her up. An hour later, I got a text from a neighbor. My mom had been standing outside my building, crying and yelling about how I was abandoning her. Other tenants had started watching, and eventually security had to escort her off the property. That was just the beginning. Emails flooded in that night. Long, dramatic messages. Some full of fake concern, I just want to talk. Others seething with anger, you are a terrible daughter. I didn't respond. I didn't even read most of them. I just kept blocking and moving on. Then, my workplace's HR department called me in. My mother had sent a complaint, claiming I was in a mental crisis and needed an intervention. It was humiliating, but also the final straw. And that's when I filed a police report for harassment. My mom had told them I had cut her off for no reason, and that she was worried about my mental health. Some were sympathetic, begging me to just talk to her. Others were harsher, accusing me of being selfish and ungrateful. Then came the escalation. I was at work, halfway through a meeting, when I glanced at my phone and saw the notification from the front desk. Another visitor. I knew before they even said it. She was there. I barely had time to react before a coworker nudged me, whispering that someone was asking for me at reception. I walked out to find my mother inside my office building, speaking with the receptionist, playing the role of a concerned parent. She had somehow sweet-talked a junior receptionist, claiming she was here for a family crisis and needed to see me immediately. Security had been called soon after, but by then she had already made a scene. The receptionist apologized later, saying she hadn't realized the full situation. After that, HR implemented a policy: no unauthorized family members allowed inside without employee consent. She turned when she saw me, her face lighting up like this was a normal reunion, like she hadn't been causing chaos for weeks. I didn't say a word. I just turned to security and asked them to remove her. They did. I went back to my desk, ignoring the stares, ignoring the whispers. My hands were shaking. The humiliation burned, but more than anything, I felt rage. That night, I talked to my therapist. She didn't sugarcoat it. This will only escalate if you don't take legal steps. I knew she was right. The next morning, I received a handwritten letter in my mailbox. This is your last chance to fix our relationship before I'm gone forever. It was emotional blackmail, plain and simple. I threw it in the trash. Extended family started reaching out again. The messages were different this time. They weren't just pressuring me to talk to my mom. They were warning me. She's really struggling. She's not eating. She's not sleeping. She might do something drastic. I almost wavered. Almost. But then I got another call from an aunt. This one was different. She didn't beg or threaten. She used religion. Family is forever. One day, you'll regret this. Your mother will be in heaven wondering why you weren't there for her. I hung up. That was the moment I knew. I wasn't just cutting off my mom, I needed to leave. A fresh start. No more living in a city where she could show up anytime, where she could reach me through family, where I would always be looking over my shoulder. I had been considering a move for weeks, but now I started taking real steps. I reached out to contacts, updated my resume, applied for jobs in another state. Within a week, I got an offer. I accepted it on the spot. I started planning my exit. Then came my mom's final, most unhinged move. She called my boss, trying to convince him I was mentally unstable. My boss called me into his office, concerned but professional. He assured me he didn't believe it, but HR advised that if it happened again, I might need legal action. That's when I decided I wasn't just going no contact. I was filing for a restraining order. He told me what happened, then reassured me that he didn't believe a word of it. I was done. I filed for a restraining order the next day. My mom must have gotten wind of it, because instead of another visit, another email, another scene, she sent a letter. A final goodbye. Since you refused to be my daughter, I am no longer your mother. It was dramatic, meant to be a last dagger to the heart. I read it once, folded it up, and put it in a drawer. Not because I cared, but because one day I might need to remind myself why I left. A week later, I packed my bags. I left the city. I left her behind. For the first time in my life, I was truly free. Moving to a new city felt like stepping into a life I had never imagined for myself. No guilt-tripping phone calls. No last-minute emergencies. No waking up to a dozen messages laced with manipulation. It was just quiet. The first few days were strange. I kept reaching for my phone out of habit, half expecting a message from my mom or another flying monkey relative trying to pull me back in. But there was nothing. No guilt. No pressure. Just silence. And then, for the first time in years, I felt something new. Peace. No more walking on eggshells. No more agonizing over whether a decision would disappoint her. I could choose where I wanted to eat, who I wanted to talk to, what I wanted to do with my day, without a single thought about how she would react. It was like I had been moving through life with a weight on my shoulders, and suddenly it was gone. Then, out of nowhere, an email popped up in my inbox. The sender's name made me pause. Adam. It wasn't long. Just a short message saying he had heard through mutual friends that I had moved. He didn't want to rehash the past or reopen old wounds, but he wanted me to know that he was glad I had finally broken free. That I deserved to be happy. That he hoped I was doing well. I stared at the email for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't feel regret. Just closure. I wrote back, thanking him. I didn't ask about his life, and he didn't ask about mine. It wasn't a conversation. It was just a final acknowledgement that we had both moved on. My mom, however, hadn't. Even though I had blocked her on everything, she was still posting on Facebook. I found out through a cousin who still followed her. The posts were the same as always. Cryptic, passive-aggressive messages about how some children forget their mothers, and how a mother's love is eternal, even when it isn't returned. Her followers, people who didn't know the full story, flooded the comments with support. I ignored it. A few relatives tried one last time to drag me back in. Your mother is struggling. She just wants to hear your voice. She's been through so much. What if something happens to her? I didn't reply. One night, while unpacking, I found an old photo of myself as a kid, sitting on my mom's lap, smiling at the camera like she was the center of my world. I stared at it for a long time before grabbing a notebook and writing a letter I knew I would never send. I wrote everything I had ever wanted to say. Every hurt, every betrayal, every moment of realization that she had never truly seen me as a person, just an extension of herself. When I finished, I took the pages and burned them in the sink. That was the real goodbye. My birthday came a few weeks later. The first birthday where I didn't wake up to a guilt-laden voicemail about how this day was just as much about her as it was about me. The first birthday where I didn't feel obligated to thank her for bringing me into the world. For the first time, my birthday was mine. Then, the inevitable happened. An email. One line. I miss you. I didn't reply. Instead, I made the final move. I changed my number. No more backdoors. No more emergency calls from unknown numbers. No more distant relatives passing messages between us. She was officially locked out of my life. In therapy, I talked about her for the first time without crying. The weight, the pain, the frustration, it was still there, but it wasn't controlling me anymore. I wasn't the scared, guilt-ridden daughter she had molded me into. I had chosen myself. For the first time ever, I was free. And I was never going back. A full year passed. A year without chaos, without guilt, without waking up to another emotional ambush disguised as love. A year of peace. My life had changed in ways I hadn't expected. A new job that I actually enjoyed, new friends who knew me, not the version shaped by my mother's expectations. My days were mine. I traveled. I tried new things. I made decisions without hesitation, without the creeping voice in the back of my mind, wondering how she would react. For the first time, I wasn't living in her shadow. Then, out of nowhere, an email arrived. Subject, can we start over? I stared at it for a long time. A year of silence, and suddenly there she was again. The message was everything I expected. Soft, sentimental, calculated. She wrote about how she had changed, how she missed her baby girl, how she had started therapy and realized how much she had hurt me. It sounded good, almost convincing, but something was missing. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of what she had done, no responsibility, just a quiet, implied expectation that I would fold, that I would step back into the role she had always reserved for me, the daughter who would forgive her, reset everything, and pretend none of it had ever happened. I didn't reply. I let the email sit. Then the floodgates opened. Over the next few weeks, more emails trickled in, friendly ones at first. She talked about family gossip, TV shows she had been watching, the weather. Casual, like we had never spent a year apart. When I didn't respond, the tone shifted. The messages became softer, filled with self-pity. She hoped I was okay. She hoped I wasn't still upset. She hoped I would remember that she loved me. Then came the guilt. I don't have much time left. You'll regret this. One day you'll understand what it's like to be a mother and how much I sacrificed for you. I just want to hear your voice before it's too late. When the guilt didn't work, the flying monkeys returned. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years reached out. Random messages popped up from numbers I didn't recognize. Your mom is heartbroken. Just talk to her once. She's trying so hard to fix things. Can't you at least give her a chance? One message made me pause. A cousin I did trust sent a short text. Your mom is struggling financially. She lost a lot of money. That caught my attention. I did some digging. Turns out she had been financially relying on another family member who had finally cut her off. Without that support, she was in trouble. Her sudden change of heart wasn't about regret. It wasn't about me. It was about control. She wanted me back because she needed something from me. I didn't reply. A week later, another email arrived. This one was different. I've been so sick. I don't know how much longer I have. If I die and we never fix things, how will you live with yourself? The final card. The last weapon she had, it didn't hit the way she wanted it to. For the first time, I felt sad, not guilty, just sad. Sad that this was who she was. Sad that she would rather manipulate me than truly change. Sad that there was nothing left to save. That night, I wrote one final email. Subject, I hope you find peace. I will not be manipulated again. Please don't contact me. I hit send. Then I blocked every email account she had ever used. And just like that, it was over. I closed my laptop, leaned back, and exhaled. This time I knew. I was truly free. 18 months. That's how long it had been since I cut my mother out of my life completely. No contact, no messages slipping through, no sudden guilt-ridden phone calls, just silence. And for the first time in my life, I was truly living. I had settled into my new city, fully carving out a life that was mine. Work was going well, my friendships were strong, and I was in a new relationship, one without fear, without the constant weight of my mother's interference. I could go on dates without checking my phone obsessively. I could introduce my partner to my friends without dreading what my mother might say about them. It wasn't just that I was free from my mother's control. I was free from the expectation of it. Then, an invitation arrived. A cousin was getting married, a big family event, and my mother would be there. I stared at the invitation for days. I didn't owe anyone my presence. I could ignore it, keep living my life, and never have to see her again. But something about that felt unfinished. I wasn't going for her. I wasn't going to make peace. I was going for me. I went. The venue was beautiful, white and gold decor, warm lights, a quiet hum of conversation. I had barely stepped inside when I spotted her across the room. She looked older, more tired. The sharp, overbearing presence she used to carry had dulled. She was surrounded by people, but she wasn't the center of attention like she used to be. Then she saw me. Her entire body stiffened, like she had been caught off guard. For a second, her face flickered with something unreadable. Surprise? Hope? She gasped softly, her lips parting, as if she was expecting me to come running to her. I didn't move. We locked eyes. I gave a small nod. Just acknowledgement, nothing more. Her expression shifted. She took a step forward. Then another. My heart pounded, but I didn't back away. I held my ground. Then a cousin stepped in, gently placing a hand on her arm. They whispered something, and my mother hesitated. She turned, and she walked away. No scene. No drama. No desperate attempt to drag me back in. She was just gone. The night went on. I danced. I laughed. I enjoyed myself without a single ounce of guilt pulling me down. When I looked up again, she had left. I went home knowing, this time, I had won. 2 years. That's how long it had been since I cut my mother out completely. No calls. No emails. No unexpected visits. Just silence. And in that time, my life had become mine. A year after moving, I met Ben. At first I was hesitant. Trust didn't come easy after everything I had been through. But he was patient, kind, and steady, showing me what it meant to be in a relationship free from guilt and obligation. Now, 2 years later, we were engaged. There was no guilt, no walking on eggshells, no fear of my mother poisoning things from the background. For once, I was in a relationship where I wasn't constantly trying to keep the peace with someone outside of it. We bought a house together, a real home. No outside voices, no pressure, no unwanted opinions. Just peace. Then, a cousin reached out. Apparently, my mother was still making her rounds on social media, still playing the victim. Daughters who abandon their mothers never find true happiness. One day, they will regret it. Some parents give everything, only to be cast aside. I didn't care. I didn't even feel the sting of it anymore. Instead of engaging, I made a decision. I went through my social media and removed every single person who had ever tried to guilt trip me into reconnecting. No more backdoor access. No more lingering ties. Then came the wedding planning. In the past, I would have obsessed over making everyone happy, twisting myself into knots to accommodate every little demand. This time, it was my wedding. And my mother was not invited. I didn't debate it. I didn't feel guilty. I simply made the choice and moved on. A week before the wedding, a letter arrived in the mail. The handwriting was familiar. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I tossed it straight into the trash. When the wedding day came, I stood in front of the mirror, dressed in white, surrounded by love and support. No guilt. No guilt. No drama. No fear of a last-minute appearance from my mother. And it never happened. She didn't show up. No grand entrance. No attempt to disrupt the ceremony. She was simply absent. For the first time, I looked around and realized she wasn't a part of my life anymore. Not in the way that mattered. She was a story from my past. And that past wasn't me anymore. Ben and I talked about starting a family, and I knew our children would never experience what I had. That night, I sat down and wrote a letter. Not to my mother. To my younger self. I thanked her for fighting, for choosing herself when no one else did. I ended the letter with one final line. I was never a bad daughter. I just finally chose myself.